unirse a nosotros hoy. Today we'll have a webinar which really excites us about public-private partnerships. Before we move on with the content, and Vanessa, if you could show the next slide, please. I would just like to go through very quick housekeeping. I will do it in both languages. Today's webinar will be both in English and Spanish. We have simultaneous translation. So please, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little globe. Please click on that globe and select the language you would like to listen the webinar with. Buenas tardes, buenos días. Nosotros hoy tenemos traducción simultánea. En su pantalla van a ver un pequeño globo. Por favor, seleccionen la lengua, si es inglés o español, que prefieran escuchar la sesión de hoy. We would like to ask you to introduce yourself in the chat box and also pose any questions you might have to any of our panelists today in the chat box as well, and select everyone so we can all see your questions in the chat box. Por favor, preséntense en el chat y si quieren hacer alguna pregunta pueden usar el chat y por favor seleccionen todos para que podamos ver sus preguntas. And a friendly reminder to speakers, please mute yourself whenever you are not speaking. And I would add, please try to stick to the allocated time of each presentation, so we have time at the end for the presentation. Un recordatorio a los panelistas que silencien el micrófono cuando no estén hablando y respeten los tiempos también. Next slide, please. Today we'll have quite an exciting session. Will be moderated by my colleague, the head of our country engagement team, Muyato Sitali. We'll start with a little bit of interactivity to also listen from the audience what is the expectation regarding this session, and then we'll go through a series of examples, case studies from multiple experts in the topic of public-private partnerships. And at the end of the session, we'll have some time for a discussion and Q&A, and we'll finalize with closing remarks by my colleague Sitali. And without further ado, I would like to invite Sitali to take over and continue with the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joao. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this SWA webinar to discuss the topic of public-private partnerships in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. Today, at this webinar, we will look into how PPPs can contribute to achieving water, sanitation, and hygiene for all, always, and everywhere. I must state by addressing the elephant in the room, we are fully aware that this topic is prone to intense debate and that PPPs are sometimes not seen as a viable solution in many countries or in some parts of some countries. On the other hand, we believe that if we want to achieve the 2030 agenda, the 2030 agenda promise of leaving no one behind, we need to discuss all the potential tools that are available. A few years ago, when we expanded our constituency base to include the private sector, our objectives were exactly this: to broaden the solutions toolkit available to countries. And I am personally very happy to see it materializing in a discussion like the one we're having today, which is focusing on a specific potential option. Our CEO, Ms. Caterina de Albuquerque, in her previous role as UN's first special rapporteur on the human rights to water and sanitation, consistently said that human rights are agnostic as to the form of service provision, public, private, or a mix, as long as the human rights to water and sanitation are realized for all and the most marginalized are not left behind. That the normative content and guiding human rights principles are respected, protected, and fulfilled, ensuring affordability, accessibility, quality, non-discrimination, among others. PPPs can support the realization of the right and don't have to be seen as an enemy. However, we know also that for PPPs to work, some preconditions must be in place, and we will talk about them all today. We have organized this learning exchange because this topic emerged organically in multiple conversations we had with countries, particularly during the sector ministers meeting last May in Indonesia. Within our partnership of over 370 partners, we have a strong basis of knowledge on the topic, and we also have government partners with a particular interest in learning more. So we're happy that this platform will help these governments and other partners to find the best way to design and implement PPPs with the lessons and experience that will be shared. Our objective for the next 90 minutes is to share multiple case studies that hopefully will answer some of the questions and challenges you may be facing in your country, while also providing further information to support your decision-making process. During the discussion, we will be presented with multiple facets of this topic, including potential advantages, as well as potential pitfalls and how to address them. Ideally, we want you to leave this session with ideas that give you a virtual blueprint of what the next steps for your country could be moving forward, with or without relying on PPPs, towards full access, to ensure that full access to safe drinking water and sanitation is achieved. And please do not hesitate in reaching out to SWA Secretariat if you would like to get in touch with any of the experts that are present in this session. So I will do a very brief introduction to the topic. What I have given you is really a brief introduction up to how we got here. Now, on the topic, the World Bank describes the evolution of PPPs in water, sanitation, and hygiene in three crucial phases. In the 1990s, there was a surge of PPPs dominated by the large concession model and the appetite of private investors to finance projects. Between 1990 and 2000, the population saved by PPPs increased from 6 to 94 million people. And the global South countries adopting PPPs increased from 4 to 38 countries. During the 2000s, there were cases of contract terminations and nervousness about the benefits that PPPs could bring in the sector, including because of several instances that PPPs, that revealed to be problematic and made headlines for the bad reasons. Regardless, between 2000 and 2007, the population saved by the PPP model grew from 97 million to 160 million, and 84% of the contracts awarded since 1990 were still active in 2007. The estimated rate of early termination during this phase is 9%, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin American countries. Authors studying this topic, authors studying why some of these PPPs failed, describe a multitude of reasons, such as soaring tariffs, non-payment of bills, poor technical performance of the sector, macroeconomic instability, conflicts between public and private actors, social and political position, lack of transparency, fluctuations in exchange rates, change in related laws, and other reasons. The third and current phase is the more targeted use of PPPs to manage specific subsets of activities and challenges, such as increasing energy efficiency and water availability through non-revenue water management, with a focus on performance-based contracting with payments against deliverables. The future of this management model and its optimization to respond to the most pressing human needs is to be defined by all of us, and while making sure that the human rights to water and sanitation are realized for all, and while ensuring that states deliver on their obligations and private companies respect human rights and comply with the UN Global Principles on Business and Human Rights, which encompass 3 pillars outlining how states and businesses should implement the framework. The state's duty to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, access to remedy for victims of business-related abuses. The first pillar of the guiding principles is the state's duty to protect against human rights abuses through regulation, policy-making, investigation, and enforcement. This pillar reaffirms states' existing obligations under international human rights law. Businesses must act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the rights of others and to address any negative impacts. Therefore, there's a possibility of both the state and the private sector to acknowledge their role in upholding and protecting human rights. In conducting due diligence, the UNGP encourages companies to conduct a human rights impact assessment through which they assess their actual and potential human rights impacts. Now, with that said, this just gives us a series of those phases that have been there, and it builds this conversation into the practicalities of what we would like to be part of the discussion, with a focus on the how and the sharing of lessons on what advantages are there and the lessons that are there to be had, so that countries that are looking to develop a PPP could actually know where they can go and also tap into the right lessons. Now, to get started, we will start with a Mentimeter exercise, so that today's session can build on the lessons learned by experts involved in implementing PPPs since many years ago. So we will have a Mentimeter exercise. I'll just check the screen to see if yes, it is there. So the instructions are, you go to www.menti.com. You can use your phone or you can use your computer. And then you enter the following code, 45922715. So if you go to www.menti.com, it will ask you for a code. Please enter 45922715. And it will ask you a question. Please do type your answer. And the question that you will be asked will be, what is the main, so you can see the question in Spanish. It is in English, the question is, what is the main question you would like to see responded to in today's session with regards to the topic that we're having? So we will just give it a second to wait and receive any input. I would like to make sure that the presenters are also building on your comments or thoughts or expectations. So somebody says they would like to receive best practices and lessons learned of public-private partnerships. Are there innovative PPP models that are suitable for sanitation, especially in informal settlements? That's a really good question. In fact, the session we're having now is the second one of the day. The session earlier in the morning, I think there was a question similar to that. Why are there so many PPPs in the water sector? That's another question. How can governments do PPPs in rural settings? How to get financial support? I imagine this is for setting up a PPP, perhaps. So let's see if we have any more questions or expectations, but I think these are good. Okay, there's one in Spanish. Quisiera que, I can see this very well, but anyway, there's one in Spanish there. So maybe one of my colleagues could put the translation in English. Incidencia y evaluación de los proyectos de agua. Then I can't see the other way. My screen is a bit small. Okay, so we do have, yes, we do have these questions and expectations that I think set the scene for what we expect to be an inspiring discussion. And at this point, I will move on to the next stage. Thank you to all of you for participating in this exercise. This input will steer the direction of the discussion going forward. And without further ado, I would now like to invite Maria Eduarda Gouveia Berto to give us her presentation. Maria Eduarda is a financial and institutional specialist in the Water and Sanitation Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Her main experience is in financial and institutional feasibility assessment of sector projects in LAC, in the Latin America and Caribbean region. She worked for more than a decade in PPP structuring with a special focus on financial modeling and project financing. During her career, she assumed multiple roles, such as being a PPP advisor for IFC. She was also Secretary of Finance for the Rio de Janeiro municipality and Director General of the Brazilian Project Structuring Company. Maria, thank you so much for honoring our invitation, and you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
I would like to thank Sanitation Water for All for the kind invitation to be part in this event. I would like to show you two case studies from PPPs, one from Brazil and the other one from Peru. These examples seek to cover certain critical points to make PPPs feasible, and we also try to answer some of the questions that we have had, such as what is the role of the governments, how to manage the projects, or how to attract private partners in low-density areas. Next, please. Before I talk about the particular case of Brazil, I would like to give you some context briefly. I think the role of the government is to promote different mechanisms to close gaps in areas around public services and infrastructures, and that these must be sustainable in time. In this context, BPPs must be understood as a means to achieve this objective, but not as an aim on its own right. Public investment projects can be feasible in terms of profitability and social profitability, but in order for these projects to be done under a PPP model, we are going to need to combine different elements, particularly the assignment of the risks of the private part, which may be in the best capacity to manage them. So the participation of the private sector under a PPP mechanism, such as state policy in different strategic frameworks at the federal, national and subnational level, is the result of this management on the part of the government. Once the policy is defined, the government must clarify and develop the framework for the promotion of the private investment, what we call a PPP framework, which depends on the actual legal framework. Therefore, in Brazil, as part of this legal framework, we created the PPI, the Investment Association Program, back in 2016. This is a part of the Ministry of Finance currently, with the aim of reinforcing the cooperation between the public and private sectors through different PPPs. The main function is to promote PPP projects and to foster relationships between different investors for different programs with other municipal and statewide actors. And we also have the National Development Bank, which funds the different infrastructures and projects, and they also act as advisors for the different government stakeholders for those PPPs. Next slide, please. So this is PPPs in figures. From 2016, we already have 153 projects that have been completed. Next slide, please. We have a total of 166 billion real. And one of the projects was to provide advice to the state of Rio de Janeiro for the regional management of sanitation services for the municipalities around the state of Rio de Janeiro. This was signed about a year ago, sorry, in 2021. Up until the moment of the assignment, the public water and sanitation company at the state of Rio would operate and maintain the different networks for the capture, distribution and treatment of the water, as well as the wastewater management facilities, with around 14.5 million people serviced across the 64 municipalities in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The company, nonetheless, had important operational challenges. Although the water coverage was relatively high, around 87%, the sewage coverage was only 42%, with high levels of counted water around 40% and a high level of unpayment also of around 31%. So the model that they sought, next slide please, what a model, what we call the regionalized concession model for water and sanitation services, both upstream and downstream for the metropolitan region, i.e. the city, the public company would remain to be responsible of the capture of the water, and then they would later sell that water to the concessionary, which would be in charge of the redistribution of the drinking water and also of wastewater. Also, they would be responsible of interacting with the users. So in this case, there is not a payment for availability on the part of the public company, and all the commercial and business management relies on the actual private sector, private company, which would charge the end users. We grouped different municipalities together. And why did we do this? Well, because generally speaking, those municipalities with a lesser degree of population would not have any economic or financial importance if they were treated in isolation. And also to ensure the feasibility, we would need to significantly increase tariffs. And in this case, we didn't have any tariff increases. We just had an adjustment during the period or the life of the contract over the course of 35 years. But there was the necessity to create 4 concession blocks, thus allowing the union of financially and economically viable municipalities together with those which were not so feasible. So in each of the blocks, we had high density or stronger municipalities, if you like, and other more weak municipalities in the same groups. And this is what allowed us to make possible this concession of so many municipalities. What was the aim? Well, it was to make the service of water and sanitation universal for the whole population. And obviously to promote investment and improve the services provided. And again, promoting investment for some $6 billion in the course of the 35 years of the concession. We also foresee to invest another $330 million in irregular settlements, the so-called favelas around Rio de Janeiro. And we also want to preserve reasonable levels of tariffs and to maintain the social tariff policy in place. I think this example partly answers the question of what the government can do to attract private partners in low density areas. So if we were to give concessions to the interior municipalities of Rio de Janeiro, which are very low in density, it would be difficult to attract private investment. But in this way, combining those more feasible with those less feasible municipalities, it was actually possible for us to attract a total of 3 companies, 3 private companies to provide services in the region. In the next slide, we will now talk about the case of Peru. In Peru, we have the Agency for the Promotion of Private Investment, Inversión, which is a specialized technical body belonging to the Ministry of Finance. They promote private investment for PPPs, asset projects, and also works in the area of tax. Up until now, there are a total of 14 PPP projects completed with more than $1.2 billion in investment. The Inter-American Development Bank also supported those PPPs in the Puerto de Maldonado. It was a PPP that aimed to improve the waste water system and the water treatment facilities at Puerto Maldonado area. This is a different model from the previous one, but it also attracted private partners which manifested an interest in the project. They needed to design, fund, construct, operate, and maintain the systems for the collection, treatment of wastewater at the Puerto Maldonado city. And in turn, they would reserve a payment based on availability and also based on the actual output, where the state would cover 100% of the remuneration on the investment. In this particular case, the business management would continue with the public services company, and the remuneration is set to be done based on payments per availability. In this case, the government provided a different solution, but it was also feasible, and it had the capacity to attract good private companies to provide services. Without further ado, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I remain at your disposal for any questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Maria. Thank you so much for those insights. And it's also good that you shared examples that touched already on some of the questions that we already had. So thank you so much for sharing these examples. We will move now to the next presenter. I would like to welcome Rodrigo Bravo, who is the General Director of Water of the Ministry of Public Works in Chile. Rodrigo is a civil engineer and holds a specialty diploma in water resources. Over the last 19 years, Rodrigo has played multiple roles within the General Water Directorate, including serving as Regional Water Director in the region of Libertado, Bernardo O'Higgins. Rodrigo, please do come to the floor, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about one very positive project in Chile. In April this year, we were able to reform the water code, which has been existing in Chile since 1981. So for the first time in 2021, we were able to reform it substantially so that it is linked to the topic that we are debating today, which is water supply to the population. So in the next slide, please. Here we see the priority axis of the code. So the human right to water and sanitation, the ecosystem preservation, sustainable production, and land management. Today, I would like to focus on the first one, the human right to sanitation and water for population. Next slide, please. Next slide. So, for the first time in Chile, we could establish a priority for this human right. Before April, any application was filed by the administration. This application had to undergo a lot of paperwork, and we saw that there was no priority when it comes to offering water supplies to populations. This led to a situation in which, when we saw a lack of water, other services were prioritized, but this system still was very important for population. With this new legislation, we were able to prioritize water, and this is thanks to the article number 5. So here we included that water is a common good for all citizens. So access to water is an essential human right that has to be guaranteed by the state. So when it comes to providing water, we have to initiate process for sanitation and give priority to them. For example, in rural areas, or also in sanitation facilities. In Chile, we have different systems in the different regions from north to south. So all systems have to apply and fulfill the recommendations and the articles. This with the aim to facilitate access to water for everybody. So in Article 5b, we see that the authority in charge will have to seek the balance between the ecosystem's preservation and the production of water facilities. This is crucial as well. Another important topic that we included in this article, which is linked to the water reality in the water code. In 1981, the legislation explained that in all water basins in Chile, a relatively big country, the code explained that it is important to maximize the exploitation of water basins. We know now that in our country, the northern part of the country has a greater access to those basins than in the south. So in this case, in this article, it was important to us to reflect that reality. Next slide, please. So how do we prioritize this? Here you can find a summary of the main axis of the code. We have the possibility to obtain water from surface resources. We also have a paragraph on rural supply to grant exploitation rights in rural areas. We offer then a temporary provision, and we also have special legislation for the payment of patents. Specifically, we realized that patents had to be applied for everybody that wanted to use water, especially in rural areas. So we also modified that. It is also important to mention that in Chile, we have been suffering a extended period of droughts. Therefore, the whole territory of the country has suffered a lot. In some municipalities, we saw limitations when it came to access to water. We understand that climate change would affect us, but now in the present, it's worse. Even in places that used to have a lot of rainfall. This means that there is a new reality now in the country, and the way to manage water supply has to be different as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So there is one specific article related to the rural sanitation systems and the right to use 12 liters per second. So we have different provisions such as inspections, technical recommendations, capacities, and requirements for the water supply systems. Next slide, please. In article number 56, we include that all water systems have to be accessed by the population, and that water has to be taken to populations included in those areas where there is a limitation of the right. And when the possibility to access water is more limited. So now these people will have access to water only by filling the requirements such as the location of the municipality and where they want to take the water from. Next slide. So the responsible committees that won't have access to those waters now with the new Article 147, they will be granted this access. This one includes that if by the older legislation they couldn't access water, now they will be able to access it. They will have the right to use that water resource. This is important and linked to the current topic. In Chile, for example, when a municipality wants to expand their network, they have to submit a financial program. This is the responsibility from the Ministry of Public Works. However, what happens is that the funding entity says the following: okay, we will expand the network, but we want to know if you have the right to access that water resource. So before the amendment, it was more difficult to access that information. For example, in certain regions of Chile, there are certain aquifers that cannot be touched. But now, in other regions in Chile, the Director General of Water didn't grant the right to explode those basins. Now, with this Article 147, we give a space to participate, to create a participation between public and private funding, to launch access to water. Next slide, please. I was already commenting this when it comes to the regulation that is applied to different committees. So all of this was included in the reform in April. The biggest beneficiary in this case is the drinking water system in Chile. Before this reform, there was only one mention in the whole legislation to population supply. Now, with this approved reform, approved by a majority, includes that sanitation and water supply is a priority. Next slide, please. So these are the current figures of today. So Chile is working to maintain water flows in wells and in the surface with a perspective to help rural areas and with a focus to preserve the environment. There are also some reserves here indicated in red that are linked to irrigation projects. Before the reform, the administration approved those projects with the amount of water that we had back at that time. With the current legislation and the current requirements, the General Directorate of Water will be the one to give priority to drinking water for people and to preserve water for future generations. Next slide, please. I think that's all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Engineer Rodrigo. That was interesting. I think it's interesting also where you started this from in terms of the legal provisions and that normative framework. So thank you for building it up from that perspective. I would like to welcome, without really taking your time, I would like to welcome Mr. David Botbajong. I hope I'm pronouncing your name well. Apologies if I am not, but thank you so much, and you're welcome to this conversation, David. David is a public-private partnership expert with the Transaction Advisory Department. at the IFC at the World Bank. David is currently based in Washington, DC, and is covering the Latin America and Caribbean region. He has experience working on PPP transactions in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America. So really coming to this conversation with a lot of experience across different regions. And David is currently developing and implementing water projects in Peru and Haiti. Prior to joining the IFC, David acquired extensive experience in PPPs in the private sector and worked with Veolia Environment in Paris. So David, we are happy you are with us today and really looking forward to your experience. Please do take the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. So my name is David Bodbanjok. It's a strange name. Sorry about that. So maybe before getting into the presentation, I wanted to introduce IFC because I find that wherever I go, people do not necessarily know IFC. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So very quickly, IFC and National Finance Corporation, we have two lines of business, investment and advisory. In terms of investment, we provide debt and equity to the private sector. That's important. And in terms of advisory, we're providing PPP support to governments. So that's basically what you need to keep in mind for IFC. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So now I'm going to talk about the way we implement PPPs within IFC, within the PPP department. We basically do it in three phases. The first phase is to determine the business case, just to make sure that we actually have a PPP in front of us when we look into a project. If we do, then we sign a mandate letter with the government. And we move to the next phase, which is basically a feasibility study and structuring of the project. So to do that, we look into technical, legal, financial, environmental issues. We do that with a consultant we hire on behalf of the government. We also market the project to potential bidders. And we talk to stakeholders, local stakeholders. That's super important because we feel that we can't do those PPPs without involving governments on a daily basis almost. And the next step is to come up with a strategic options that we present to the government, and we let them choose their preferred option. Once they chose their preferred options, we ask them to give us the go-ahead to prepare the tender process. And so to prepare the tender process, we basically need to draft a contract. We do that with lawyers that we hire again on behalf of the government. And then the goal is to basically be able to identify a private operator that would sign a mandate with the government. So we currently work on more than 100 transactions around the world. We mainly focus on infrastructure, a little bit of social infrastructure. And again, we do that all around the world. We do that in urban areas or rural areas. There is a little bit of a difference between urban and rural, but I'll talk about it in the next slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about one of our experience in Africa, in Benin, where we implemented a PPP in rural areas, which was quite challenging. So some of you may have heard that the government of Benin signed a 10-year affirmage contract with a French consortium in April 2022. That was for more than 420 rural water systems. And those systems will be covering almost 7 million people. I think the current population in Benin is more than close to 10 to 12 million. So it's going to be covering most of the country. And the project will enable the government of Benin to reach their 2030 SDG number 6. That was an extreme focus for the government. They were obsessed with reaching this SDG. And I think they should be able to reach it by well before 2030. But I don't think the project would have been able to be implemented without the support of the World Bank, which was able to mobilize almost $500 million to the government through a loan. And the idea was basically rehabilitate some of those water systems and build new ones. So let's go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in terms of the 10-year affirmage I just talked about, wouldn't have been possible without, again, a pilot project that was implemented by IFC. We started working on 10 small sites that were just covering 42,000 people. And we grouped those 10 sites in 4 clusters. The idea was to just create economies of scale. Again, without this pilot, we don't think it would have been possible for the government to sign this 10-year affirmage with this French consortium. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, the pilot project was proposed as a transaction based on an 8-year concession agreement. So you may remember that the government recently signed a 10-year affirmage contract, but when we work on the pilot, we propose an 8-year concession agreement. You may ask, why 8? Well, the government was comfortable with 8. They didn't want to hear anything about 10. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but we agree on that, and we were able to move forward with the project anyway. So we were able to award the project to 3 local winning bidders, and I'm emphasizing on local. And those local bidders were able to mobilize funding locally from local banks. And the idea of this project was to be replicated not only in Benin, but also around the world. So what we're currently doing is, next slide, please. Next slide, we're trying to replicate what we've done in Benin in the Caribbean, in a super complicated settings. In Haiti, because the setting is super complicated, we feel that we can't select 10 sites. We had to start with 1 site and see how it would go. So we have selected the city of Las Caobas, which is close to the Dominican Republic. It's a city of 26,000 people. The government is going to, the World Bank is going to provide a grant to the government, a grant of $5 to $6 million to rehabilitate the entire network in Las Caobas. And we feel that it's the only way for the project to move forward and for us to be able to attract a private operator. So the work of the private operator will be similar to what will be done in Benin, with one main difference. We're going to ask the operator to install meters in all connections. And if we are successful in Las Caobas, the idea will be to replicate in the entire country. So obviously it's going to be super complicated. I don't know if you heard the news. I know everything is focused on Ukraine, but things are not going very well in Haiti as we speak. There is cholera, there is kidnapping every single day. So we were supposed to start the project and start rehabilitation. We had to stop everything, but we are hoping that we'll be able to go back and continue our works very, very soon. So this is it for me. I'm available in case you would have any questions. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. And thanks also for helping with the pronunciation of your names. And really, really appreciate this insight from Benin and Haiti. And the contexts are quite different, but it's good to hear the steps that you take, and also the 3 steps that you had at the beginning. That I think helps people to know how this works for you. Now, before we, and if you could stay with us just in case we have questions, I'd like to see if at this point we can take in any questions. So give me a second. So we have, before we get to Senor Diego, I'd just like to see if we have any questions. If we could hold the slide on the last one that David had. We have I think this is a comment. It's actually a question from Saima Ashraf, who is in Pakistan. In a country where government is least interested in PPP, what can be the solution? Can it be addressed by SWA through a mechanism that involves the government? Okay, Simon, I think let's hold this question so we could see if we have any more questions that particularly focus on PPPs for now. Do we have any questions? Doña Yamilet, I see your hand is up. Would you be able to, do you want to speak, Doña Yamilet? I think we've allowed you to be able to speak if you have a question. Okay, maybe that hand was not for a specific question. If you would like to speak, please go ahead if you have a question.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. I will speak in Spanish. I apologize. I would like to ask, how do you proceed to maintain and operate the system? Is there a charge, a fee for the users, or how do you go about it? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let me ask if any of our panelists so far would be willing to take that question. Anyone from those that have already talked?
Yeah, I don't mind. I can talk about the specific project that I just presented.
Yes, please.
So yes, we want people to pay for water the same way they pay for their telephone, right? When it comes to paying for the phone, nobody will hesitate to pay for it. We want it to be the same for water. So even in Haiti, people will have to pay less than $1 per cubic meter, but still, we want them to pay. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thanks, David, for coming back to the floor and for providing that, for sharing that comment. We have a few more questions, but I'll come back to these questions after we get the next round of insights. So David, thanks. As I said earlier on, I would like at this point now to invite Diego Felipe Polania, who's a, sorry, 1 second. Yes. So the topic of PPPs is directly interlinked with regulation, and that is why at this moment it is my pleasure, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Diego Felipe Polania Chacon from the Comisión de Regulación de Agua Potable y el Saneamiento Básico of Colombia. Diego is an economist, and he holds a master's degree in competition and market regulation from the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. He has extensive experience in the public sector, where he has served as Director of Sector Development at the Ministry of Housing, City and Territory. He has also held the position of Deputy Director of Water and Basic Sanitation in the National Planning Department, and was also a consultant at the IDB, among other positions. Dr. Polania was appointed expert commissioner by the President of the Republic, Ivan Duque Marquez, the previous president, since April 2019, and in August of the same year, he assumed the executive director role of the entity, a position he held until August 2021. So really happy to have you, Dr. Diego. Please, if you could take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Satali, for your introduction. I would like to thank Sanitation and Water for All for the kind invitation. I would like to try to be brief and give you a short presentation. What we want to do is to tell you what the model of PPP is like in Colombia and what the regulators have done in this case. It is the Commission to make it viable or to enable the environment on the conditions for this project. Very quickly, I will tell you briefly about this additional context. The Colombian government is a centralized one, where from the national, the state-wide government, they design and implement the public policies. And this is where we have the Water Regulation Commission as the regulating body for the whole of the country, in charge of designing the ways the tariffs are set up. For instance, there is a possibility which will be part of the discussion we will have later, and that's whether they should apply the regular or general regulation or to do specific contracts for agricultural use. Whenever we resort to those contracts, we need to go by the actual regulation in any case, but the general regulation doesn't necessarily need to be applied as such. And then we have companies and communities, small community organizations, which operate the systems and provide the people with water. Next slide, please. In general terms, and this goes hand in hand with the legal developments that made it possible to incorporate private capital to this model, we have a law known as the Public Services Law, Law 142, which was passed in 1994, which aims to facilitate the actual scenario to make it possible for private enterprises to enter the public services domain. As we understand it in Colombia, in 2012, we had the law 1508, which sets the condition for the establishment of PPPs as understood in Colombia, and they are somewhat regulated based on law 142. Next slide, please. So what is the difference in the two models? In terms of the norm, this is the key. And with the traditional model for PPPs in Colombia, when you do a project, an infrastructural project, be it for transport, for energy, or for water-related projects, we could resort to the traditional contracting process where the state pays upfront payments to the contractors for completing those works, and this payment is done regardless of the compliance with the service. And this is where we start seeing the problems, because sometimes we have a payment and sometimes the infrastructure does not comply with which was requested. And you can actually add to the budget, to the original budget, up to 50% of that value. This gives rise to a whole range of discussions around changes in the conditions, in deadlines, etc. And payment is done based on the actual work of the infrastructure, not necessarily based on the quality of the service. And on top of that, there is not a specific structure for certain investors, such as institutional or financial investors, the big investment funds, for instance, to enter this sector. With this situation, we had very many problems in public works in the country, and this is what gave rise to the option of PPPs as an option to improve these contracting models and therefore improve the actual provision of the services. What we understand as a PPP includes the idea that no upfront payments are made, and no payment is made for the actual infrastructure per se, but rather for a service. So the payment is completed once the service is up and running, and when certain standards are complied with. We can have some additions, obviously, based on the actual potential changes in the contracting process. But these additions, these additional payments, can not be any higher than 20%. And again, the payment is done not for the infrastructure itself, but for the service it provides. Services provided with a previously acquired or agreed quality level. This also includes institutional funds, pension funds, as well as large investment funds, which can now participate. This is, in very general terms, the current law in Colombia. If we apply this to the water sector, because again, this is applied to the building of roads, hospitals, any kind of social infrastructure goes by this law. For the specific case of water and water management solutions, there are certain specific norms or rules that are followed in order to ensure that these projects are led adequately. First, when the contractor is not a public service company, in other words, they are not experts in providing this sort of waste management service, for instance, they must have a partner, a third party, with the necessary expertise in order to ensure that investors lack sufficient experience, not only in the construction, in the building, but actually in the later provision of the service itself. The contractor also undergoes different checks by a public body, and all the works is going to be overviewed. We have set a series of service standards and indicators which will determine the level of compliance in the areas of drinking water. These are specific, measurable, and adequate indicators, and these indicators are somewhat harmonized with the actual conditions of the regulator, of the drinking water regulator. And on top of that, the Commission issued Resolution 749 from 2017, which applies to all water management operators that want to be part of this basic water and sanitation service. We have set up, as I said at the onset, we can have either a general or a contract-based tariff, and in PPPs, we determine that the tariff will be contract-based, so they do not need to apply the whole regulation to the letter, but rather the parties can agree in the contract a specific rate or tariff. The responsibility of the provision of the service falls on the actual contractor under the contract, and the standards must be at least the same as that set out by the regulation. This is important because at the end of the day, if a Colombian citizen is being served under the PPP or any other model, this should not be a case or a reason for receiving a different kind of service or different standard of service. So at least the standards have to be the same, and higher standards can nonetheless be agreed upon. Having said that, when somebody applies the general framework, there is a resulting tariff level. If I go to the contract-based tariffs, there are certain restrictions in the norm that says that you cannot go over a certain level. In the free domain, you do not have such restrictions, but everything is going to be based on the structure of the PPP project. So the contract is open, and if you are on the free market, you can reach the rate or tariff level you wish, insofar as a project is insured with indicators or against the indicators. So this should be a project where public resources are totally safe, and we are attracting private capital with the idea of the non-existence of that limitation for the tariffs, except from what it is actually set out in the law. We had several cases in Colombia under this model, an aqueduct at Santa Marta, a city capital, a capital city in the department, and the other one was the waste water management treatment in the capital city, Bogota, which was structured as a PPP, but then didn't follow the whole PPP path. The project had the whole process, but when it came to the practice of it, it didn't follow the usual PPP pathway. So these are the two lessons learned in these two particular cases, where due to technical and bureaucratic reasons, we might start with a PPP, but then you end up not implementing it as a PPP. We are now discussing how to improve the ways to enable these PPPs in the country. And we are sure that this is the way to go. We already have certain cases of success. And I think that's all from me. We are obviously open to anything and to everyone and to new learnings from the colleagues. So thanks again to Sanitation and Water for All, and I remain at your entire disposal for anything you need. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you so much, Diego. That was very insightful coming from a regulator's perspective. And I think if there's one thing that I could just reiterate was the point you made, that there's no reason the service in terms of outcomes should be different, or people should be receiving a poor quality just because of who the service provider is, and that's what the regulator is doing to make sure that the standards are upheld. So thank you so much for sharing that and for really giving us this experience of Colombia. I have a feeling that there might be others that might want to hear a bit more from you later on. I'd like to invite Mariana Cabello Deza, who is joining us from Peru. She works for Aloxi. I believe this is the Alliance for Works for Taxes. So Aloxi brings together 31 companies committed to development of Peru and works mostly in the area of public works taxes. Mariana is a lawyer and holds a master's degree in business administration, as well as specialization courses in the area of social responsibility and works for taxes. Now, before Mariana picks up the floor, I'd like to just encourage, if you have any questions, please still put it in the chat. And if you want to raise your hand, do as Yamilet has done. If we have more time, we'll get back to everyone. Thanks, Neil, for responding to the question that Saima had asked. So that one has been taken care of. And for now, let's go to Mariana. Mariana, over to you. We cannot hear you if you're speaking.
No le escuchamos, Mariana. No sabemos si está hablando.
Okay, ahora sí.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate. Today, I would like to talk briefly, first of all, about Aloxi. As you already mentioned, is the Alliance for Works for Taxes, which includes companies that are committed with this mechanism. It is important to mention that this mechanism differs from PPPs because this mechanism doesn't include a commitment to benefit. Instead, they do it to develop the country for social justice and for the influence in their regions. This is very positive, and what companies do can be returned in taxes. I would like to explain how this works. There are different investment mechanisms. Today we've talked about PPPs, about public works as well, but works for taxes enable to execute public projects that are charged to the taxes of the private companies. How do these mechanisms work? They work as a payment in which companies pay their taxes in advance by executing a construction work. Once this is executed, they obtain a certificate of public investment that enables them to pay their taxes in the future. This way, companies make sure that their taxes are going to develop those services that are important for the regions in which they are located. How do they work? So basically, the public entity chooses the project, that is obvious. We can carry out all types of projects, water and sanitation in this case, but also health, education, among others. We can also develop natural infrastructure projects to boost water resources as well. But all those projects are chosen and have to align with the national development plans and the regional and local development plans. They have to go through a feasibility declaration project process. In Peru, this is called the National Investment Service. They have to comply with the objectives and the established indicators in the annual report for investments in Peru. So once we prioritize these projects to be handled in the works for taxes system, the companies choose the project and then we have a tender process. So once the company is chosen and the investment project is signed, the private company is the one that will have to bear all responsibilities and tasks to respond before public institutions. They can be national, regional, or local. So it is interesting to see that it's going to be the private company through a private tender. They're going to choose the provider. So that's going to be a private relationship between the private company and the tender. That's going to take place in the private sector to execute the work. What can we include in the funding of these projects? Not only the construction of the work itself, but also all technical reports and studies. Here in Peru, we see some pitfalls when it comes to the drafting of those technical studies. They face many challenges in this process. So we also fund the equipment for the project and the training for the users and beneficiaries. In the case of water and sanitation, we will be able to raise awareness among users so that they know the importance to pay a fee, a tariff for water, but also the training for users, as I was saying, and also training for the companies that are going to be in charge of the operation of the project. In addition to that, this enables us to maintain infrastructure and to operate it accordingly. So we ensure that it's going to be maintained in the long run. What are the benefits for this state? Obviously, state accelerates these projects in Peru. In the case of water and sanitation, we have more than 3 million of Peruvians that don't have this service. So we see such a big gap. So it is important for everybody to collaborate. These mechanisms enables the government to relieve their need of human resources or technical resources, and they can focus on other important projects for population. It is also important to see that all risks are sent to the private sector. So the government is not going to receive any benefit until the whole project is not finished and infrastructure is already available. So we could say that there will not be a payment until the project has not been fully finished. So in Peru, we have more than 230,000 construction works that have been stopped. So this mechanism somehow avoids that situation. Why? Because the private company really sees the importance of finishing the project, because they will only receive the money once the work is under the pipeline or when the work is finished. So the company really sees that motivation, because otherwise they will not receive the payment back. Additionally, their reputation is also at risk because of their commitment towards the community. So we have pledged more than 1,900 million US dollars. It is important to mention that around 92% of the projects are focused in regions that are not a capital, such as rural areas. This is crucial for communities in need. When it comes to sectors, we see that the sanitation sector is the third one. We see that there has been a huge investment in transport and education. When it comes to sanitation, we see that there is an investment of around $920 million. Sorry, 260 million US dollars. This amounts to 559,000 people that have benefited, and different companies that have invested in these projects. Here, I want to show you some examples. This is for drinking water, sewage, and wastewater treatment in Cusco. We can also see Ancash and the Ministry of Households with around 137 million people who benefited from it. We have here other example in Ancash as well, Moquegua. So in different sites of our national territory, we can see that there are different projects that are in the pipeline. Some of them have been finished and the population is already benefiting from them. To finish with, I would like to add that in Peru, this mechanism is an innovation from Peru that's been replicated in Colombia. It's giving good results, but it has a wider potential. The state capacity to provide projects to regional and local communities throughout the year is around several $million. If we check the capacity of companies, because if half of their taxes is devoted to these projects throughout the year, they could make an important profit while focusing on priority projects for community. So to finish with, I always mention the SDGs, especially the 17 SDG, and how private and public sector align for a common vision. And I think that this system works for taxes is the best example that the private and public sector can work together to provide important services for population, such as water and sanitation. I hope that I have not exceeded the time, and I'm open to any question or comment that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. We really appreciate your insights. We've really had very good examples from Peru, from Colombia, Benin, Haiti, and also the macro picture that we got also right at the beginning from our colleagues at Inter-American Development Bank. Mariana, there is a question for you from Yamilet in the chat. She's basically asking what anti-corruption aspects apply in this case of Peru, and also whether the quality of the service and water provided to the population is monitored. If you could just reply in the chat, because I would like to bring our last but not least experience, which will be shared, and then if we have more time, we'll get more discussion. But I'd like to ask Pablo to come to the floor. Pablo studies political science in Barcelona. He's responsible for campaigns at the European Federation of Public Service Unions. And also, just in the interest of time, I'll quickly ask Pablo to speak. His past experience includes being on the steering board of the Global Water Operators Partnerships Alliance. So Pablo, over to you. If you take 3-5 minutes, and then we could allow more conversation. Thanks, Pablo. Over to you.
Well, I hope you can hear me. I've been switching channels, so if you cannot hear me, please let me know.
We can hear you well.
I would like to mention that I work for the European Network for the Public Service Unions. Just to keep it short, we have received different criticisms when it comes to PPPs. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. So since I have less time now, I would like to go directly to the point. We think that the universality of the access to water sanitation is crucial. That has to be the guiding principle of any public policy. So water and sanitation policies are public policies in the end, and this public policy has to have criteria that go beyond profit. And this is the contradiction that PPPs present for us. We currently live in a moment in which everything is changing. Recently, we've been talking about adaptation and mitigation with climate change. So it is important that governments have the necessary tools and mechanisms to apply investment in the water and sanitation sector. One problem that we have found, and I can copy it on the chat, because we have 4 studies that are at the base of our position, the one that I would like to explain today about why criticize PPPs. The underlying situation is that there is an important risk when it comes to drafting the contracts and signing them. Sorry, I got distracted. So hidden depth. When there is a concession for 10, 15, 20 years, in Europe, the experience is that concession reclaims payments for a higher amount that stated in the contract. This has a domino effect in other departments for public administrations. There is a transfer of money that was not included in the original contract. Another important issue here that we have to bear in mind when developing PPPs is to clarify who is going to assume the risks if there is a lack of an agreement. We've also experienced this whenever there are problems regarding any accidents or natural catastrophes. Very often we see that the one that was granted a concession, they neglect the responsibilities and the state has to face all the risks. So it is important that in PPPs, we give space to consider these situations. Then, when we bear this in mind, initial calculations are different. In the end, for us, the underlying condition is the investment of the private sector. Sometimes this investment might not be more beneficial in comparison with the public funding if the public institutions don't understand really what the risks are, because obviously collaborating with banks and interests, that is more beneficial in some cases. It is important also to work against corruption, but I think that we see the motivation to move from a past model that in the past was regarded as being close to corruption. And I don't think that this has to be seen as an enemy. All users need to have the same guarantees, the same quality in their water, the same criteria. But in the end, we have to understand if one of the costs is higher than other costs due to different conditions, then we have to understand what conditions, environmental conditions, have to be developed to obtain fair conditions. Otherwise, other more beneficial projects are going to attract private funding. So we always see that lack of balance between PPPs. PPPs serves as motivation sometimes for the private sector, but sometimes they leave no other options for states. So bearing this in mind, we wanted to include a new model in which we can purchase at a greater scale, we can develop planifications bearing in mind the whole cycle of water. And I would like to finish with the need to understand the cycle of water in our public policies, bearing in mind all the challenges that climate change creates. And I'm going to leave it there for the time being. I hope that I have not exceeded the time.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I think we're almost even coming to the close of the conversation. We really wanted to have a balance in terms of the different views that are out there, and you do provide us a specific perspective in terms of some potential risks. So thanks for sharing that. We do not have a lot of time, but I think the question that Doña Yamilet had asked has been responded to in the chat. So I think that one has been taken. If I can ask just very quickly one question to David Bot-Bajong and then one question to Maria. David, when PPPs in rural and less densely populated areas are often left behind in this type of discussion, even though they seem to be a fit for purpose solution in many cases. What needs to happen to replicate some of the examples you mentioned, for example, in the Haiti and Benin case? What needs to happen to replicate that? So if you could take really just a few seconds, David, and then I'll come back to Maria with one quick question, and then we should be bringing this to a close. David, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, please.
So we just need government to reach out, and that's one. Two, we would need governments to be able to train the local community local private operators, because for those kind of projects, we don't need international operators, I think. It can be done in-house. And lastly, we need the bank also to get involved and to finance local projects, especially in rural areas. That's basically it in a nutshell.
Thank you. Maria, if I could, thank you so much, David. Maria, if I could ask a quick question from you from the publication that the Inter-American Development Bank did and the presentation that you have made today. Your bird's eye view of PPPs in the LAC region is impressive in terms of what you have studied in that region. From what you have been observing, what role do you think PPPs will play in the Latin American Caribbean region from now until 2030 in contributing to achieving SDG 6?
I think the PPPs will play a major role given the deficit of financing we need to achieve the goal, right? Billions of dollars a year need to be financed in water and sanitation to cover the gap in water and the access in water and sanitation. So I have no doubt that the PPPs will be one of the ways to finance it. Also other innovative finance schemes, but PPPs will will play a big role, as it was said here in several occasions, and I try to emphasize in my presentations that. Although it's one a solution for addressing the gap, it requires a strong PPP framework and a strong government agencies to support these PPPs, and clear communication with the investors and well-structured PPPs to be financed. So for the private investor to come, they have to see the insurance of the flows of the secured flows of revenues guarantees for them to implement investments and keep with the operations and maintenance.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's very helpful. Now, unfortunately, our time is fast spent, and Neil, I've just seen your hand. Unfortunately, I won't be able to, because we already passed the 90 minutes mark. But I think we've had really interesting experiences today in terms of what has come out of the research that Maria was sharing on the experiences from David covering Benin and Haiti, and also the experiences from Costa Rica, from Peru as well. And also Pablo bringing in some critical questions for thought for those that are thinking into going into this direction, and just wrapping it up with what road we see going into 2030 in for PPPs. Now, obviously, this is dependent on the government and partners in every country. So for us as the Secretariat, we intended to provide this as a platform for conversation and to have an honest discussion. It's obviously not a sufficient time. 90 minutes is not long enough. So there will be room for more conversations in the future. I would like to indicate to all governments present here today, please reach out to SWA. So if you would like to take this conversation forward, so we can work on the next steps with you, if you are looking to get more information from any of the experts that you have heard today. To all participants, if you're not a partner of SWA yet, please do consider applying to join SWA in whatever constituencies. We've got 6 constituencies: government, civil society, private sector, research and learning, utilities and regulators, including external support agencies. So please do feel very free to join SWA. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. You will receive the recordings of this session. I know some people asked for PowerPoint presentations. We'll see how we can make that available, but most of this information will be on the website. A very huge thanks to everybody who's helped to organize this in the Secretariat, and also our partners who made it possible, as well as all the speakers we've had today. Muchas gracias, and do have a good day. Thank you.
Gracias.